The woman stood at the edge of the lantern's weak glow, rain dripping from her hair onto the dirt floor, her body trembling not from cold alone, but from the weight of a choice no mother should ever have to make, and behind her, half hidden by the darkness of the barn doorway, were 3 children, thin as fence rails, barefoot, their clothes clinging to them like wet paper, eyes hollow with a hunger that had long ago stopped being just about food and had become something deeper, something that gnawed at hope itself. The man inside the barn had not expected visitors that night, least of all a woman who looked like the world had already broken her twice and was waiting to see if it could do it again. And when she finally stepped fully into the light, he saw the bruises time had left on her face, not the purple kind, but the quiet ones, the kind etched by grief, by sleepless nights listening to children cry softly so they wouldn't wake each other, by days spent begging storekeepers who stopped meeting her eyes. Her name was Mara, though no one had spoken it kindly in a long time. And the man, Elias Crow, owner of the land, the cattle, the barn, and very little else that still felt alive inside him, watched as she lowered herself to her knees. Without being asked, the mud soaking into her skirt as if the earth itself wanted to claim her. And when she spoke, her voice didn't shake the way her hands did, because she had already spent all her fear on the walk there, saying the words over and over in her head like a prayer she wasn't sure. God still heard. "Please," she said, not looking up yet, "my children haven't eaten in 2 days." And at that, one of the children whimpered softly, the sound sharp as glass in the quiet barn, and Elias felt something twist in his chest, something he hadn't felt since the winter he buried his own family under, frozen ground. He said nothing, because men like him had learned that silence was safer than hope. And that was when Mara lifted her face, rain streaking down her cheeks so it was impossible to tell what was water and what was tears. And she said the words that would echo in his mind long after that night was over. "I'll serve you forever, Master, if you feed my children tonight." And there was no seduction in it, no expectation of kindness, only a brutal honesty that stripped the moment bare. And Elias flinched at the word master, not because it pleased him, but because it sickened him, because it reminded him of how easily power could rot a soul. And he saw in her eyes not submission, but defiance strangled by love, the kind of love that would kneel in the mud and still refuse to die. The children behind her huddled closer together, the oldest, a girl of maybe 10, placing herself in front of the younger 2 as if shielding them from a blow that hadn't come yet but always might. And Elias finally spoke, his voice rough, unused, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years, asking the only question that mattered, how long? And Mara didn't hesitate, because hesitation was a luxury she no longer owned. "As long as it takes," she said. "Longer, if you ask." And the rain beat harder on the barn roof, the sound like a drum counting down something irreversible. And in that moment, Elias saw the world exactly as it was, cruel enough to starve children, indifferent enough to force a mother to bargain away her life for one night of bread. And instead of answering her, he turned and walked toward the house without a word, leaving her kneeling there in the mud with no idea whether she had just saved her children or condemned herself. And every step he took felt like walking deeper into a past he had sworn never to touch again, because the last time he had let himself care, he had lost everything. And yet when he reached the door, he stopped, shoulders heavy, and said over his shoulder in a voice that was not command but something closer to surrender, "Get them inside." And the relief that broke across Mara's face nearly knocked her forward, but she didn't cry out or thank him, because mothers like her learned early that gratitude could wait until children were safe. And as she gathered them close and followed him into the warmth and light, none of them could know that this single act, this night of bread and fire, would begin a chain of choices that would test every boundary between mercy and control, dignity and survival, and force all of them to confront what it truly meant to owe someone your life, when all you wanted was for your children to live the warmth of the house hit them like a shock. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that made the children gasp and cling tighter to their mother, their bodies unused to anything but cold floors and colder nights. And Elias watched from the far side of the room as they stood just inside the door, uncertain like animals, rescued from a storm, but still expecting the blow that usually followed kindness. And he told himself again that this was only for the night, that feeding starving children did not mean opening old wounds. Yet his hands betrayed him as he moved faster than he meant to, setting bread on the table, pouring stew into bowls that had gone untouched for months, the steam rising like something holy. And when he finally nodded for them to sit, the youngest child, a boy no more than 5, didn't wait for permission but stumbled forward and grabbed the edge of the chair as if afraid the food might vanish if he looked away. And Mara caught him just in time, whispering softly, reminding him to say thank you, reminding herself that manners were the last thing poverty was allowed to steal. Elias turned his back then, pretending to busy himself with the fire because he couldn't stand the sound the children made when they ate, too fast, too desperate. Like every bite might be their last, and the noise tore at something buried deep inside him. Memories he'd packed away after the winter, when his wife rationed soup so the children could have more. After the night, he held a small hand that went cold before dawn. Mara ate last, barely at all, watching their faces soften as color slowly returned to their cheeks. And for the first time in weeks, her shoulders lowered a fraction, as if the world had loosened its grip just enough for her to breathe. And when Elias finally spoke again, it was not about payment or service, but about rules. Because rules were how he kept chaos at bay. "They'll sleep in the back room," he said gruffly. "You'll take the cot by the stove." And Mara nodded immediately, accepting whatever scraps of dignity she was allowed. But when he added, "No one owes me anything for this night," her head snapped up, confusion flickering across her face like a match struck in darkness. And she opened her mouth to argue, because hunger had taught her that nothing was free. But Elias cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the fire. "Don't make promises you don't understand," he said. And the words landed heavier than any demand could have, because they carried the weight of a man who knew exactly what it meant to lose everything by letting desperation dictate the terms of his life. That night, as the children slept curled together like kittens, Mara lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady crackle of the fire and the slower, uneven breathing of the man in the next room, wondering whether she had crossed a line she could never step back over. And for the first time since her husband died on the road looking for work, that never came, she allowed herself to feel something dangerous, hope, and it frightened her more than hunger ever had, because hope had a way of making loss unbearable. Dawn came quietly, pale light slipping through the windows, and Mara rose before anyone else, instinct guiding her hands as she cleaned, swept, mended a torn shirt she found folded near the wash basin. Because service was the only language she trusted. And when Elias saw her later, standing at the table with needle and thread, his first reaction was anger, not at her, but at himself, for allowing a situation where kindness could be mistaken for ownership. And he told her, sharply, that she didn't have to do that she should wake the children and eat. But Mara only shook her head gently, eyes lowered, saying, "I need to work." And those words, so simple, so final, hit him harder than her plea the night before, because they carried not submission but survival. The stubborn refusal to be useless in a world that discarded the weak. And as the day unfolded, neighbors began to whisper when they saw smoke from the chimney again, when they noticed children's laughter drifting across land that had known only silence. And Elias felt the eyes of the world creeping back toward him, judging, speculating, ready to twist mercy into something ugly. And he realized then that feeding those children had not been the risky choice. Letting them stay would be, because it would force him to confront not only his past, but the kind of man he intended to be when kindness demanded more than a single meal. By the third night, the land itself seemed to know they were no longer alone. The old boards of the house creaking under footsteps that were not just Elias's, the wind carrying sounds that had been missing for years, small voices, cautious laughter, the scrape of a chair being dragged too close to the fire, and with those sounds came attention, the kind that never arrived empty-handed, because the neighbors began to pass slower on the road, eyes lingering, mouths tightening with questions they didn't dare ask aloud. And Mara felt it immediately, the way a hunted thing senses the shift in air before danger shows its teeth. She kept the children close, teaching them to move quietly, to stay out of sight. Not because Elias had asked, but because survival had trained her that. Safety was temporary and could be revoked without warning. And when Elias noticed how she flinched at every knock, how she straightened as if preparing for judgment, he understood that feeding a family was the easy part. Protecting their dignity would cost far more. Trouble arrived in the shape of a man named Harlan Pike, wide-shouldered, sharp-eyed, carrying the authority of someone who spoke for the town, whether it had elected him or not. And he didn't bother with pleasantries when he stepped into the yard, his gaze sliding from the children, peeking through the window to Mara's still form behind the door, and then settling on Elias with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Didn't know you were running a refuge now," Harlan said, his tone light, his meaning heavy, and Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to retreat, to let silence swallow the moment. But when he glanced back and saw the oldest girl pressing her hands against the glass, fear flickering across her face like a warning flare, something inside him shifted. Something that had been dormant since grief hollowed him out. And he met Harlan's gaze steadily, saying only, "They're staying." And the simplicity of it seemed to offend the other man more than any argument could have, because Harlan laughed softly, shaking his head, reminding Elias of the unspoken rules: no dependents, no charity cases, no women who came with stories too heavy to carry. And when his eyes slid toward Mara again, something sharp passed through them, the kind of interest that stripped a person down to what could be taken, and Mara felt it like a hand closing around her throat, her mind racing, already rehearsing apologies, already preparing to leave before being told, because leaving on your own terms was the last scrap of control poverty allowed. She stepped forward then, placing herself squarely in the doorway, shoulders back despite the tremor in her knees, and spoke before Elias could stop her. "We'll go," she said quietly. "We won't cause trouble." And the relief that flickered across Harlan's face made Elias's jaw tighten, because it confirmed everything he feared, that the world found it easier to remove the desperate than to confront its own cruelty. And without raising his voice, he said, "No, not to Mara, but to the idea that mercy had to ask permission." And when Harlan scoffed, warning him of consequences, of rumors, of how quickly kindness could turn into suspicion, Elias surprised even himself by stepping closer, his voice low, controlled. "I've buried enough to know what matters," he said. "If that bothers you, you can take it up with the dirt." And the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind and the faint sound of a child's breath catching in fear. And Harlan, sensing he'd pushed too far, backed away with a thin smile, promising this wasn't over, the words hanging in the air like a threat. That night, as the children slept, Mara stood by the window watching the road, every muscle coiled, ready to run, and Elias joined her without speaking, both of them staring into the darkness that seemed closer now, more watchful. And she finally asked the question she'd been carrying since the barn, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" And Elias didn't answer right away, because the truth was complicated and painful and still bleeding. But when he spoke, it was honest. "Because once," he said, "someone needed help, and I was too late." And in that moment, Mara understood that whatever bargain she thought she had made that night was already broken, not because she owed him less, but because what bound them now wasn't hunger or fear, but a shared understanding of loss. And as the wind rattled the windows and the world outside sharpened its knives, both of them knew that sheltering one another would demand more courage than either had left. Yet neither stepped away, because sometimes survival wasn't about running anymore, but about standing still and refusing to let the darkness decide who deserved to. Live, the first real consequence arrived not with shouting or fists, but with absence. The quiet kind that spread through the days like a sickness. As the butcher's door stayed closed when Mara passed, as the woman who once slipped her bruised apples now turned her back, as the children noticed how laughter from the road died the moment they stepped into view, and Elias felt it too, the way business slowed, the way a man who sold feed suddenly needed payment up front, the way kindness became costly the moment it refused to stay hidden. Mara carried the weight of it all without complaint, rising before dawn, working until her hands cracked and bled, because she believed, wrongly, that if she could just become useful enough, invisible enough, the world might stop trying to erase her children. And Elias watched her from a distance, torn between gratitude and shame, because every act of service she offered felt like a debt he never wanted to collect. And yet, refusing, it felt like stripping her of the last thing she believed she controlled. The children changed too, no longer shrinking into corners, but testing the edges of safety. The youngest laughing freely, the middle one asking questions about the cattle, and the oldest, Lena, watching everything with eyes too old for her years, studying Elias the way one studies weather, searching for signs of an approaching storm. And it was she who spoke the truth aloud one evening as they sat around the table. The fire low, the air heavy. "They don't like us," she said simply. And no one corrected her because lies offered no shelter. And Mara reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, promising that none of it mattered as long as they were together. But Elias saw the doubt flicker in the girl's eyes, because children understood power better than adults liked to admit, and they knew when it was shifting against them. The breaking point came with the visit from the council. 3 men standing in the yard like a verdict, their voices polite, their intentions sharp, speaking of propriety of concern, of how arrangements like this invited misunderstanding. And when Elias refused to send them away, refused to define Mara as anything but a mother protecting her children, the threat finally surfaced. Thinly veiled, loss of contracts, of land support, of what little protection the town offered to those who stayed in line. And Mara listened from the doorway, heart pounding, already preparing to disappear in the night, because that was what the world expected of women like her, to remove themselves so decent men didn't have to choose between mercy and belonging. She packed quietly that night, wrapping bread in cloth, tying the children's shoes with hands that shook only once. And when Elias found her by the door, the truth spilled out in a rush of apologies and gratitude and resignation, her voice breaking only when she said, "I won't let them punish you for us." And something in Elias finally snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. And he told her she wasn't a punishment, she was a mirror, and that the town's comfort was not worth the price of 3 children learning they were unwanted. And when he took the pack from her hands and set it down, the gesture simple and final, Mara realized that staying was no longer about survival alone. It was about being seen, and that frightened her more than leaving ever had. The next morning, Elias did something he hadn't done since. His family died. He opened the gates and invited people in, not to explain or justify, but to bear witness, to see the children fed, to see Mara working with quiet dignity, to see a household rebuilt not on bargains or fear, but on choice. And though many turned away, some stayed, their silence shifting from judgment to discomfort, because it was easier to condemn desperation than to admit how easily it could belong to anyone. And as whispers turned into arguments and arguments into lines drawn in the dirt, Mara understood that the words she had spoken in the barn no longer defined her future. But they had lit a fire that forced everyone involved to choose who they were when compassion stopped being convenient, and the storm gathering on the horizon was no longer just about one woman and her children, but about whether a community could survive the truth of its own indifference. The storm did not arrive with thunder, but with decisions, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. And as the days grew shorter and the air sharper, the tension wrapped itself around the house like wire, tightening with every whispered conversation and every averted glance, until even the children felt it pressing against their small chests. Lena growing quieter, the younger ones clinging closer to their mother, and Mara waking each morning with the certainty that the fragile peace they had built was already being measured by men who had never known hunger. Elias worked harder than ever, driving himself until exhaustion because motion kept regret at bay. But the land seemed to resist him, a fence collapsing here, a cow going lame there, as if the world itself demanded payment for his refusal to comply. And when Harlan Pike returned, he did not come alone this time, bringing with him 2 men and a document folded neatly in his coat, his voice smooth as he spoke of debts, of irregularities, of how quickly property could change hands when a man stood isolated. And Mara listened from the shadows, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it, knowing that her presence was the unspoken reason for every threat. And when Elias tore the paper in half without reading it, the sound was like a gunshot, sharp and final, and Harlan's smile vanished, replaced by something colder, promising consequences that would reach far beyond words. That night Mara made her decision, not because she wanted to, but because motherhood demanded it, and she sat across from Elias at the table long after the children slept, her hands folded tightly, and told him she would leave before dawn, that she would take the children and disappear where the town's reach ended, because she could not watch another man lose everything for her sake. And Elias listened without interrupting, his face unreadable until she finished. And then he said something she had never expected to hear, something no one had ever offered her before. "You don't get to decide this alone." And the words broke something open inside her, because they implied partnership, not ownership, shared risk instead of sacrifice. And for the first time she understood that what bound them now was not charity but choice, and that frightened her more than hunger ever had. Dawn brought the reckoning, as Harlan and his supporters arrived with wagons and witnesses, prepared to claim what they believed the law would hand them, and the children watched from the porch, fear etched into their small faces, while Mara stood beside Elias, not behind him, her spine straight despite the tremor in her legs. And when accusations flew and voices rose, it was Lena who stepped forward unexpectedly, her voice clear and carrying, telling them simply that her mother worked harder than anyone she had ever seen, that they paid for every meal with sweat and silence, and that if kindness was a crime, then she hoped they were all guilty. And the words cut through the crowd like a blade, because truth spoken by a child left no room to hide. And even as Harlan sneered and pressed his claim, something shifted among the onlookers, discomfort rippling outward as they were forced to see themselves, reflected in the fear of 3 children. The standoff ended not with victory but with postponement, the matter delayed, the threat lingering. And as the wagons rolled away, leaving ruts in the dirt like scars, Mara felt the weight of uncertainty settle heavier than before, because delay was not safety, only borrowed time. And that night, as she tucked the children into bed, she realized that whatever the outcome, they had already crossed a point of no return, not because of a bargain spoken in desperation, but because they had chosen to stand together when the world demanded separation. And the cost of that choice was coming, whether they were ready or not. The end did not come with fire or blood the way Mara had feared in her darkest nights, but with something far more difficult to survive: truth spoken, aloud, and the quiet unraveling of lies that had held power for too long. And when the council gathered again, this time in the open, with the town drawn in by rumor and unfinished business, Elias stood before them without anger, without defiance, only a steady resolve that surprised even himself. And he spoke not of charity or sacrifice, but of responsibility, of what it meant to live in a place where survival was treated like a privilege instead of a right. And as he spoke, Mara watched from the edge of the crowd. The children pressed close, her heart pounding, because every word felt like it might cost them everything. Harlan tried to interrupt, to twist the story back into something manageable, but the ground had shifted beneath him as others stepped forward, quiet men and women who had seen hunger in their own homes, who remembered winters when kindness had been the only thing that kept them alive, and the truth, once released, spread faster than fear ever had, and the council's threats dissolved into embarrassment and retreat, because power that could not justify itself had nowhere left to stand. When the matter was settled, not with triumph but with reluctant acceptance, the crowd thinned, leaving behind a silence filled with possibility. And it was in that space that Mara finally spoke, her voice trembling yet clear, telling them that she had once believed her worth could be measured by what she was willing to give up. That desperation had taught her to kneel when she should have been allowed to stand. And as she spoke, she lifted her chin, meeting eyes that had once looked through her, and the children watched wide-eyed as their mother reclaimed something hunger had tried to steal, her dignity. Elias did not speak again, because the moment no longer belonged to him. And when they returned to the house, the land felt different, not safer but honest. And that night, as the children slept, Mara and Elias sat by the fire, not as debtor and benefactor, not as master and servant, but as two broken people who had chosen not to let the world finish the job. And Mara thanked him then, not for food or shelter, but for refusing to let her desperation define her. Future and Elias admitted that she had saved him too, by forcing him to live instead of merely endure. Seasons passed, and though life remained hard, it was no longer cruel in the same way, because the children grew strong, laughter returning fully to the land, Lena helping in the fields, the younger ones chasing chickens and dreams. And Mara worked not out of obligation but pride, her place earned not by sacrifice but by belonging. And one evening, as the sun sank low and the world glowed gold, Elias handed her a set of keys, not as a symbol of ownership, but of trust, and told her the land was theirs to tend together. And Mara closed her fingers around them, feeling the weight of a future she had once believed impossible. And she thought back to the rain-soaked night in the barn, to the words she had spoken in desperation, and understood at last that love, when it was real, did not demand forever. It simply showed up, fed the hungry, protected the vulnerable, and stayed. And in a world that had asked her to kneel, she had finally learned how to stand. And her children, watching from the doorway, learned the same.